Hello, my name is Ben from Ben Stacey Solutions. Welcome to today's video. Today we are going to be looking at how to mix sound using these. So today we're going to look at how to mix sound. I'm going to use these little wooden blocks just to help you understand there are two common problems that I find people often make when they're mixing sound. And I want to use these, as I say, as a way of demonstrating what those problems are and how we can fix them. So let's jump onto the table and we'll have a closer look. Okay, so there are two key problems that I so often see when people try to mix sound. There's two things that they get wrong. I'm going to try and just take you through what those problems are using these bricks. So what I quite often see when people come to mix sound is they'll take things like, say for example, this is a bass guitar, okay? Bass guitar sits down here. And then they'll take, say, a keyboard. The keyboard will sit here. And then there'll be a guitar, and the guitar might sit something like that. And then they will have some backing singers, and the backing singers might sit kind of something like this over here. And then they might have an electric guitar, which will sit something like that. And then they might have a lead singer, which might sort of sit something like that on the top. Now, what we have here is not really so much a mix of sound as just a sort of jumbled mess. There's no real thought process that's gone into how these things interact with each other, and that's the key thing when it comes to mixing sound. You've got to think about how these things interact with each other. Okay, we're not talking about a bunch of individual instruments or a bunch of individual bricks. We're thinking about how those things interact and how, as a whole, that forms the mix of sound that we're looking for. The two problems that I see that people have when they mix sound is, number one, the frequency range. Okay, and what I've got here across this load of bricks here, effectively this side of the mix here is going to be representing the low frequencies of sound, and this side of the mix is going to be representing the high frequencies of sound. And what people don't often think about is the range of frequencies that they have available. And so often, most of the instruments that we have, particularly in churches, things like guitars, keyboard, drums, bass, voices, those sorts of things, they very often have a lot of frequencies that are in the middle. There's a lot of mid-frequency in all those things. And so often this mid-frequency just becomes cluttered and messy, and it doesn't fit together very well. There's just a lot of stuff that's all trying to compete for space here in the middle. And yet the extremes of the frequencies that we have available just aren't used. This width is all here, but we're not using it. We're not mixing to the width that we have available. So instead of having something that looks like this, what we might do instead is we say, well, we start with our bass guitar, and our bass guitar is going to sit down the low frequency end. But rather than extending up higher than it needs to, what we might decide to do is to reduce the size of our bass frequencies down, take some of the high frequencies out, and have a slightly smaller bass sound. And then we might have something like, say, a keyboard, and our keyboard can actually then sit side by side with our bass guitar, because our bass guitar has just been chopped down that little bit further, and the keyboard can now sit quite comfortably in the middle. And then we might have, say, our guitar sound, where before our guitar might have sat something like this. And what we might decide to do is to just chop a little bit of our low frequencies out of our guitar, and our guitar can sit neatly alongside there. And so we've now got this base layer of sounds which are starting to sit together a bit more neatly, and we've not got that competition. Things have got a bit of space and a bit of separation, and then they've all got their spots there. And then maybe rather than looking at a whole drum kit, we're going to look at just the cymbals, okay? And the cymbals are going to sit right at the top. And again, where before they might have competed here a little bit in the high frequencies, let's just shape that a little bit more. And this time we're going to take our low frequencies out of our cymbals and just push our cymbals right up to the top. And now things are really starting to even out. Okay, and then from there we can then start to build on top of that. And now we can put in some backing vocals. But again, maybe rather than having a whole broad section of backing vocals, maybe we want to trim the backing vocals down a little bit as well. And then maybe we've got a lead guitar part. I don't know, maybe we want a lead guitar part a bit more full. Maybe that's going to sit well in the mix. And then on top of that, we could then put a lead vocal. But again, our lead vocal might start competing with some other things. So again, maybe we just shape the lead vocal a little bit to fit in there. Now, I've used a lot of maybes in this sentence because I don't want to tell you this is exactly what you need to do to your mix to make it sound great. It's going to depend very much on your context, your instruments, and what you have available. It also depends on the system that you're using as to how much width you have available. If you've got a system with sub-bass speakers, you're going to have a better extension into the low frequencies than somebody who doesn't have that frequency band available. So you need to think about your system, and then what instruments have we got, what band have we got, what kind of sound do we want to create. But just think about those things. Think about how can I shape those sounds so that they're not competing with each other, but they have space and they have separation and they have their own frequency spaces that they can use. And then the second thing to think about is the layering of those sounds. This is your volume levels basically, so things that are quiet are going to be sat down at the bottom of the mix, things that might be a little bit louder are going to start to come up, and then the things that are the loudest of all are going to sit on top of that again. And so we not only have a width of space available, but we have a height of space available as well, and we have quiet things, louder things, and the very loud things on the top. As I say, most of what we do is going to be based in this mid-frequency band. You are always going to find that there's a lot of stuff going on in the mid-frequencies here. But if you can separate things out, if you can shape things so that they're not competing for that space, we can start to make things fit together much more naturally. Very often you need to not think about things as an individual. This lead vocal sound, if you listen to it in isolation, it might sound very thin, might sound very scratchy and not very pleasant, but actually you put it in the mix of sound of everything else, and something that on its own didn't sound that great, blended with the rest of the band and the rest of the voices and the rest of everything else that's going on, actually this sits in really well here perhaps. So that then leads me on to a slightly broader issue that I wanted to discuss, and that's not so much about how we shape things to make them fit as we want them to, but the attitude that we have towards sound mixing. And what I mean by that is, I think there are kind of two levels, if you like, at which we can approach mixing sound. The first level that we can take when we're mixing sound is a scientific level. It's very much about looking at sound, and when we come to shaping sound and EQing sound, we can have a very scientific approach which says my voice, whatever this might be, is feeding back at a particular frequency point, so therefore I'm going to shape my frequencies very specifically to get rid of problem frequencies, things that might be feeding back. If it's a voice, quite often we will have sort of resonant frequencies. They can be a bit honky, they can be a bit unpleasant to listen to, and so we might say, I'm going to shape this in a very scientific manner, deal with the problems, get rid of feedback points, get rid of resonant frequencies in the room that are just sounding a bit harsh, a bit honky, a bit unpleasant to listen to. We're just going to shape it in such a way that it's functional and it's very clinical in the way we mix that sound. And on a basic level, that's okay. We can mix sound in that way, and if all you can do is just find problem frequencies and remove them, then that's fine, and that will get you through a basic level of mixing sound. But actually, I think there's the sort of second level, the second step on from that, which is more of an artistic way of mixing sound. And so you can move from the scientific to the artistic way of mixing sound, which is to say, not so much about let's just deal with problem frequencies, but let's actually think about how these things blend together. How can we make these things sit nicely together? How can we make something that is musical? Because ultimately when we're mixing sound, we're mixing music, and music is an art form. And so we need to think about how can we make this that is something of a musical art form. And so we have to have that kind of quite creative approach to doing some of this sound if you're going to take your sound mixing on to the next level. Some very specific examples of this might be on a voice. I would quite often apply an effect, some reverb and some delay, and actually I would quite often apply multiple layers of an effect. So I could quite easily, for example, have 3 different reverbs that I would apply to a voice. So I could have quite a small room reverb, I could have quite a large hall reverb, and I quite often use a plate reverb on a voice, and the combination of those 3 things can work really well together. So there's 3 different reverbs that I'm applying to a voice, and I don't necessarily want to apply the same amount of each of these reverbs to the voice. So I might have my voice sound, I'll apply to it a small amount of room reverb, a slightly larger amount of the hall reverb, and then the top layer will be of plate reverb. and I will combine those things to make the whole sound overall. You need to think about those levels of the sound that you're creating, those layers of that sound that you're layering up, and how are they going to sit together. This isn't necessarily, by the way, an exact how-to guide. This is just things to think about when you're mixing this sound. And then once you've got your vocal sound with all your various effects on it, how does that then affect the rest of the mix? You've got all your various other instruments all sat in here, and probably you're going to want various other effects and reverbs and whatever else you might have on all of these things. How is that all going to sit together? Another example where we might see a move from just a purely scientific approach to a more artistic, creative type approach is in your EQing. You can EQ in a very scientific way, which is, there's a problem, let's deal with it. And then you can move from that to a, how do I blend two guitars, for example? How do we make those two guitars sit together? Quite often what you would do is you would shape one of those guitars to be more of a low frequency guitar. Perhaps your rhythm might have a bit more body, a bit more depth to it. So you take a rhythm guitar that's going to go more into the low frequency band, and then you take a lead guitar part, which is more of a high frequency band, and so you shape those two, one slightly lower, one slightly higher. So instead of being very unpleasant in the mid frequencies, you just shape them slightly so that there's a bit more space between them, and those two sounds can sit much more naturally together. And that's an example where you can move from just a purely scientific dealing with problems and removing them approach to an artistic, how do we blend these two sounds and make them fit together nicely. You need to think beyond just the individual instrument and think about, how do these two things work together. The guitars example actually is a really good example to how this works, because if you take a lead guitar in isolation in that way, actually what you'll probably find is this will sound quite thin, quite scratchy, fairly unpleasant to listen to perhaps. But actually you bring the two guitars together, because they're not competing for that mid space and they can sit together side by side, actually as a whole the guitars can sound really great, and you can have the depth and the body from the rhythm guitar with the high frequency of the lead guitar, put the two together and they blend really nicely and they can work really well together like that. Okay, so I hope you found that helpful. As always, I'd love to know your thoughts and your comments. If there's anything you like to do in your mixing sound, then let me know. Join in the conversation below. Jump in on the comments, let me know what your thoughts are. And if you've got any questions, or if you want to just know more about how to mix sound, then please get in touch. The link to our new website is down below. So go over to our website, have a look on there. You'll find all our contact details. We'd love to hear from you. So join in the conversation and we'll see you soon.